Hello friends, wonderful greetings of the day to all of you. So today we are going to discuss one of the major events which happened recently, that is the collapse of the Sri Lankan economy and how did it actually manage to make itself stand in these uncertain global scenarios. So basically, Sri Lanka being a developing economy, what are the major shortcomings which actually hampered its overall functioning, its overall effectiveness? What went wrong in its basic conduct, which we Indians should actually take care of? So we are going to discuss the brief overview of this particular topic in detail. So here it goes. Let's start. That is the Sri Lankan crisis, and so what lessons India can learn in order to sustain its economy in these uncertain global times. Basically, debt and economic crisis can set back decades of gains in per capita incomes and poverty reduction in developing countries. Once cited as a success story in the developing world for meeting the basic human needs for a low-income country as early as the late 1970s, Sri Lanka was in the midst of the worst debt and economic crisis since independence in 1948, which basically led to the mass protests among the public. Debt servicing has become unsustainable with economic and political consequences. In a preemptive move on 12th April 2022, Sri Lanka temporarily suspended foreign debt payments pending a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. This may prompt international rating agencies to downgrade Sri Lanka to restrictive or selective default. Sri Lanka's public debt to GDP ratio rose from 91% to 119% between 2018 and 2021. At the end of March 2022, Sri Lanka had external debt service payments of $6 billion for the remainder of 2022 against the foreign reserves of 19 billion US dollars. I repeat, Sri Lanka had external debt service payments of $6 billion for the remainder of 2022 against the foreign reserves of 19 billion US dollars. On 6th April 2022, all the members of a plotted 26-member cabinet resigned apart from the president and the prime minister following mass public protests over the rising cost of living and economic mismanagement. So basically, what lessons we should learn from this mishappening in Sri Lanka? So after the months of opposition to his administration over the worst economic crisis in the country's history, Sri Lankan President Gotabaya Rajapaksa resigned. Sri Lanka's parliament convened to start the process of electing a new president thereafter. Sri Lanka used to be a middle-income economy, continuously improving on social indicators, but economic mismanagement by the government led it to collapse. Everything started with the tourism industry, which was severely impacted first by bombings carried out by the Islamic extremists targeting hotels and churches in 2019, and then by the coronavirus outbreak by the following year. So basically, the tourism revenues contributed to 5.6% of the Sri Lankan GDP in 2018, but fell to just 0.8% in 2020. India, as a country, is also dependent on tourism, as this sector contributed 9.3% to the country's GDP in 2019. The Indian tourism industry also needs to cope with the setbacks created due to the coronavirus pandemic, or the revenue source could be lost. The government of Sri Lanka under Rajapaksa reduced the value-added tax, that is the VAT, to 8%, reduced the corporate tax from 28% to 24%, and abolished the pay-as-you-earn tax and the 2% nation-building tax, which financed infrastructure development. All of these led to a 33.5% decline in registered taxpayers. India is also in the process of reforming its tax structure with the introduction of the goods and services tax, reduction in corporate tax, and exemption of individual taxpayers with taxable income up to 5 lakh rupees by providing a 100% tax rebate. These reforms need to be implemented with caution. In 2014 State of the Economy report, the Institute of Policy Studies of Sri Lanka called attention to a hot money policy, unsettling borrowing habits, then the ephemeral and shallow quick fixes, and a monopoly of foreign direct investment flow into the hotel industry. When compared to 2005, Sri Lanka's foreign debt more than doubled, rising to $56.3 billion by 2020. The country's foreign debt increased from roughly 42% of GDP in 2019 to 119% of GDP in 2021. The nation needed to pay $4 billion in debt by the end of 2022, but as of April 2022, the government foreign currency reserves were only $2.3 billion. According to the RBI data, at the end of the March month 2022, India's external debt was placed at $620.7 billion according to the statistics available, recording an increase of $47.1 billion over its level in end March 2021. As a recent RBI report, 5 Indian states have been flagged as highly debt-ridden states. India should manage its debt to GDP ratio to avoid defaulting. The government of Sri Lanka printed more and more money in order to deal with the debt liabilities, but that actually led to the depreciation of the Sri Lankan rupee, leading to the falling forex reserves. Hence, India should restructure debt, but at the same time should also boost exports to deal with any upward impact on forex reserves. In April 2021, Rajapaksa announced that the country will not only allow organic farming, banning the chemical pesticides and fertilizers, negatively impacting the production of tea and rice. Sri Lanka used to be the second largest tea exporter in the world, but bad agricultural policies led to the downfall of the industry. In November 2021, the government abandoned the organic farming plan, but the damage was already done. This led Sri Lanka to import rice worth $450 million in 2021. Hence, a big lesson to learn for India from this situation is to be self-sufficient in its food production. As per the data released by the Ministry of Consumer Affairs, around 1,550 tons of food grain have been wasted during the COVID-19 pandemic in the Food Corporation of India's godowns due to a lack of proper mechanism to store the food grains. And this should be avoided at all costs, especially at a time when food resources have become scarce all over the world, with the situation exacerbated by the Russia-Ukraine war. The ongoing war also contributed to the collapse of the Sri Lankan economy, as Russia is the second biggest market for Sri Lankan tea exports and also a major source of tourism. All these factors contributed to the fall of Sri Lanka, resulting in electricity and fuel shortages and a rise in inflation. This placed the country at a standstill, with health services being impacted, midterm examinations being postponed due to a shortage of paper, and also affecting the trade and diplomatic relations with other nations. India as a country is also dealing with a set of unique economic problems that need to be dealt with carefully in order to avoid a future crisis. Firstly, India has a reserve oil storage of 74 days, but this needs to be increased, keeping in mind the ongoing fuel crisis around the world created due to the Russia-Ukraine war. And here it's noteworthy that Russia has become the second largest, it has actually become that is the second largest country to export oil in India. Second lesson to be learned from the Sri Lankan crisis is India seems to be on the brink of a power crisis with the ongoing coal shortage at a time when the country is dependent on fossil fuels for more than 60% of electricity generation. Third, the Indian rupee has depreciated 5.9% in 2022, which will further result in decreasing forex reserves, which have already plunged to the lowest ever value in the past 15 months. Fourth, Indian inflation soared to 7.79% in April 2022, which should be avoided at all costs, as seen in Sri Lanka, where angry protesters raided the government institutions to express outrage over increasing prices. Lastly, that is the fifth point, is industrial production should be increased in tune with the government's plan to produce the goods worth $1 trillion by 2025, and at the same time exports should be increased to earn sufficient forex reserves to deal with the debt liabilities and the ever-increasing cost of imports due to the unstable global atmosphere around fuel and food. This point is very important because fuel and food are the major sectors which have been impacted at quite great extent in this Russia-Ukraine war. Hence, this crisis is, after all, not local but global. Since it's the global economy, that is the open economy, so if the major shift is happening in one of the countries, that will lead to the overall disruptions in the supply chain, and hence the crisis happening is actually not local but global. So, mounting debt, social unrest, food shortages, and out of control fuel prices are some of the key causes of spreading economic gloom in rich and poor countries. That is, neither the rich countries would be spared nor the poor countries would be spared, since these are the major operating sectors: food, fuel, which would affect the overall social stability, and economic turmoil would be created if these sectors face disturbances. So each country must find its way to face its peculiar conditions and challenges. The response to the crisis, therefore, to reinvoke a once fashionable but now nearly forgotten neologism will have to be glocal. I repeat, it's glocal. That is the amalgamation of the two terms, global and local. That is meeting global calamities with local opportunities. I repeat, that is meeting global calamities with local opportunities. Hence its overall SWOT analysis. For us in India, the lessons from Sri Lanka would be obvious. Strong, if not visionary, leadership. That is, strong leadership, social cohesion, fiscal prudence, and smart steering of the ship of state through globally troubled waters. I repeat, strong, if not visionary, leadership, social cohesion, fiscal prudence, and the smart steering of the ship of state through globally troubled waters, as opposed to excessive populism, doles, bailouts, ideological grandstanding, and continuous civil unrest. So the latter are among the biggest threats to democracies and free societies the world over. Let us wake up for us. Despite the worldwide contagion, the enemies are much more internal rather than external. So basically the point being stressed over here is we need to boost our overall immunity. We do not have control over the external environment. That is the uncontrollable factors or the uncontrollable parameters should not be our area of focus. That is, we can't control them. Hence we should focus on actually maximizing our strengths, our core areas of strengths. So basically, Sri Lanka's experience offers 5 basic lessons for other indebted developing countries, especially for the Indian economy in our case, in order to mitigate the economic and social costs of a crisis. Firstly, net benefits can result from going to the IMF early. The government hesitated for nearly 18 months after COVID hit from seeking IMF assistance to solve its balance of payments difficulties. Instead, a raft of homegrown remedies, for example, loose monetary policy, stringent import controls, and bilateral swap arrangements with regional economies were deployed to little effect. Concerns existed within the government that the austerity policies the IMF demands would be politically unpopular, including the overall political expenditure cuts, higher taxes, a floating exchange rate, and the removal of fuel subsidies. But the advantages of the International Monetary Fund assistance seem to have been underplayed, including a low interest loan to bail out Sri Lanka, the ability to borrow from international capital markets once again, and the benefit of IMF financial advice. A worsening economic and political crisis forced the government into a U-turn in mid-March 2022 that Sri Lanka will seek an IMF program. Second is strengthen the safety nets to mitigate poverty and political instability. Sri Lanka basically has a British-style welfare system providing free healthcare and education, as well as a Samurdhi poverty reduction initiative for 1.2 million families. However, these mechanisms were insufficient to stem growing poverty and social discontent over the rising food inflation and shortages of food and fuel. In an ideal world, a temporary rationing system for basic food and fuel should be introduced early in a crisis, followed by donor-funded cash transfers targeted to the poorest. Thirdly, what's the third lesson we need to learn from the Sri Lankan economic collapse? That is the parallel requirement is effective crisis management capabilities. Sri Lanka has fragmented crisis management capabilities, which hinders effective economic decision making. In March 2020, a large and unwidely presidential task force was created to coordinate the COVID-19 response. In March 2022, two overlapping committees, one of key ministers and another of business leaders, were appointed to tackle the debt crisis. In early April 2022, a panel of eminent economists with experience of international institutions was appointed to advise the president on debt restructuring and the IMF program. In an ideal world, a US-style President's Council of Economic Advisors should be mandated with offering objective economic advice to the President, supported by a National Economic Monitoring Unit within the Ministry of Finance. What's the fourth major lesson to be learned from the Sri Lankan economic crisis is? A strong macroeconomic and financial regulatory structure is necessary to reduce the economic costs of a crisis. The Central Bank of Sri Lanka lies at the heart of Sri Lanka's regulatory structure. However, a lack of autonomy means that the central bank's monetary policy and exchange rate decisions were influenced by the short-term political pressures. Not only is the governor of the central bank appointed by the Sri Lanka's president for a 6-year term, but the monetary board, which manages the central bank, includes the secretary of the treasury. In an ideal world, the government would be in an ideal world, the governor would be appointed by the president on the recommendation of a group of eminent persons, like a constitutional council, without any parliamentarians, and the monetary board would have the governor, and a deputy governor and 3 independent members. So the Treasury Secretary would not sit on the monetary board. And the 5th major lesson is conduct honest public communication to avoid the spread of misinformation. Historically, ineffective government communication has resulted in considerable public confusion and misunderstanding about Sri Lanka's crisis and the IMF program. So the public has tended to rely on social media, which has provided variable quality data and analysis. In an ideal world, a lean government information unit would be created, staffed by media professionals dedicated to honest messaging about the economy. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to economic crisis management. Hence, these lessons from the Sri Lanka's economic experience should be tailor-made to the circumstances of others facing similar circumstances. Hence, I repeat these lessons because these are of major concerns, especially for the Indian economy being the developing one. Firstly, net benefits can result from going to the IMF early. Secondly, strengthen the safety nets to mitigate poverty and political instability. Thirdly, that is drawing a parallel requirement for the effective crisis management. And then the 4th requirement is a strong macroeconomic and financial regulatory structure is the basic necessity to reduce the overall economic costs of a crisis. And the 5th lesson to be learned from this crisis is to conduct honest public communication to avoid the spread of misinformation. Hence, I need to summarize with this basic highlight, which I have mentioned in my argument. So I would like to repeat this basic statement because it's of paramount importance for us to actually keep in our mind in order to face these global uncertainties with the proactive approach. So the crisis is, after all, not local but global. Mounting debt, social unrest, food shortages, and out-of-control fuel prices are some of the key causes of spreading economic gloom in rich and poor countries. But each country must find its way to face its peculiar conditions and challenges. The response to crisis, therefore, to reinvoke a once fashionable but now nearly forgotten neologism will have to be glocal, that is to meet the global calamities with local opportunities. So for us in India, the lessons from Sri Lanka would be obvious. Strong, if not visionary, leadership, social cohesion, fiscal prudence, and the smart steering of the ship of state through globally troubled waters, as opposed to excessive populism, doles, bailouts, ideological grandstanding, and continuous civil unrest. And so the latter are among the biggest threats to democracies and free societies the world over. Let us wake up for us. Despite the world contagion, the enemies are much more internal rather than external. So, thank you so much. Have a good day.